Welcome back to A1 Storyteller, the place where real stories ignite real emotions, where every word you hear comes from a place of truth, pain, resilience, and the deepest parts of the human heart. Today's story is not just another headline, not just another tragic mistake hidden behind a badge or lost in the noise of the news cycle. No, this is a story about a family who loved each other with every beat of their hearts, a family who believed they were safe inside the walls of their home. Until one night, everything they trusted was ripped away in a burst of violence they never saw coming. It's about a mother's scream that shattered the night, a father's hands, trained to heal and defend, soaked in the blood of the daughter he had sworn to protect. It's about the little girl who dreamed of saving lives, now fighting to save her own because of a mistake she never could have prevented. It's about how quickly the protectors became the destroyers, about how a country that promised safety delivered terror right to an innocent family's doorstep. But it's also about what happens when grief is met not with silence, but with courage, when heartbreak is met with defiance, when a family, broken but unbowed, turns their suffering into a weapon stronger than any gun, their voice. This isn't just a story you'll listen to. It's a story you'll feel burning in your chest, a story that might just leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, family, and the true cost of mistakes. Stay with us to the very end, because once you hear what happened next, you'll never forget the name Nia Johnson. And neither will the world. Angela Johnson had always believed that their life was a blessing. Their modest home in suburban Atlanta was filled with love, laughter, and dreams. Every morning, the sun would spill through the kitchen windows as Angela packed lunches and kissed her children goodbye for school. Marcus, her husband, would call her from wherever he was deployed, his voice steady and warm, always ending the call with, "Tell my girls and my little man I love them." Their 15-year-old daughter Nia was a bright student with dreams of becoming a doctor. 10-year-old Jordan loved superheroes and often wore his cape around the house, making everyone smile. Evenings were sacred. Homework at the kitchen table, family dinners filled with stories, and bedtime hugs that lasted a little longer than necessary. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it was rich in everything that mattered. Love, trust, dreams. In their little corner of the world, they were safe. Or so they thought. Angela often thanked God for the peace they lived in, believing that as long as they had each other, no harm could touch them. But life, cruel as it can be, was waiting for the perfect moment to shatter their world without warning. The night it all changed was eerily quiet. Angela had just finished helping Nia with a history project while Jordan slept peacefully in his room, his favorite stuffed animal tucked under his chin. The clock read 8:47 p.m. Angela was laughing at something silly Nia had said when a violent, earth-shattering bang rattled the door off its hinges. Screams filled the house before Angela could even process what was happening. Flashlights, boots, guns. It felt like a war zone, not her safe little home. Angela's instincts screamed at her to shield her children, but before she could even raise her hands in surrender, the sound of a gunshot ripped through the air. Time froze. Nia, her beautiful, bright, full-of-life daughter, gasped and crumpled to the floor. Mess. Blood spread like a terrible stain on the hardwood floor. Angela screamed, a sound so raw and primal it tore from her soul. She threw herself onto Nia's body, trying desperately to stop the bleeding, her hands shaking, her mind refusing to believe what was happening. The officers realized too late they were in the wrong house, but the damage had already been done. Their perfect, blessed life had been shattered into pieces too small to ever fit back together the way it was before. Officer Kyle Raines had only been on the force for 6 months. He had always dreamed of wearing the badge, believing he could protect and serve with honor. But fear was a wicked master, and in the chaos of that night it ruled him completely. When he kicked down the Johnsons' door, his heart was hammering so hard it blurred his vision. The training he had received evaporated in the blinding confusion. All he saw was movement, a figure running toward the living room. And without thinking, without seeing, he pulled the trigger. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the home, followed by a sound he would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. A young girl gasping for air as she collapsed to the floor. Kyle stood frozen, the gun trembling in his hand, the reality of what he had done washing over him like a tidal wave. He hadn't shot a threat. He had shot a child. Blood pooled at his feet, staining his boots, as the mother screamed a sound that made even the other officers flinch. Somewhere deep inside, Kyle wanted to fall to his knees and scream too, but all he could do was stand there, hollowed out by horror and regret, knowing there was no way to undo the damage his fear had caused. Miles away, Marcus Johnson was finishing a long day of training when his phone vibrated against the dashboard. It was a call he would never forget. Mrs. Ramirez, their elderly neighbor, was sobbing so hard he could barely understand her words. But he heard enough. Cops, gunshots, his home. His family. Without a second of hesitation, Marcus turned his truck around and slammed his foot onto the gas pedal. The world outside blurred as he raced against time, terror clawing at his chest. Memories of his wife's laughter, of Naya's first dance recital, of Jordan's superhero poses, they flooded his mind, threatening to break him. Marcus had faced war zones, stared down enemies with rifles aimed at his heart. But nothing compared to the fear he felt as he sped toward his family. He wasn't just a soldier in that moment. He was a husband, a father, a man on the verge of losing everything that made life worth fighting for. Marcus's truck skidded to a halt outside his home, the flashing red and blue lights painting the night in horror. He barely registered the police cars or the shouting. All he saw was his front door blown open, the place where his family once felt safest now a battleground. As he sprinted toward the house, a young officer reached out to stop him, barking orders Marcus barely heard. In a flash, his training took over. With a precision that only years of Delta Force SWAT experience could forge, Marcus disarmed the officer and had him face down on the ground before the others could even react. Guns were raised, pointed at him, fear flashing in the officer's eyes. But Marcus wasn't afraid, not for himself. His voice boomed across the chaos, louder than the sirens, cutting through the night like a blade. I am Commander Marcus Johnson, Delta Force SWAT. Stand down immediately. The officers froze. Time seemed to hold its breath. As Marcus threw his credentials onto the ground in front of them, the truth washed over the stunned police officers. They hadn't just broken into an innocent family's home. They had invaded the sanctuary of a man trained to protect and defend at the highest level. A man who had spent his life risking everything for a country that just pointed guns at him on his own front lawns. Inside, Angela's desperate cries shattered whatever was left of Marcus's composure. He charged into the house, the smell of gunpowder and blood hitting him like a physical blow. There, lying in a pool of red too large to comprehend, was his little girl, his Nia, his star, his reason for breathing. Angela was pressing her hands into the wound, sobbing, her eyes wild with fear, sobbing her. Without a word, Marcus dropped his knees beside them. His hands, usually so steady and sure, shook as he assessed the damage. Years of battlefield trauma care guided him now. He ripped off his jacket and used it to apply more pressure, checking her pulse, whispering to her to stay awake, to hold on, to fight. Daddy's here, baby. Daddy's got you, he whispered, over and over, a mantra against the unbearable weight crushing his soul. He could hear the ambulance sirens screaming closer, but all he cared about was the tiny flutter of life he could still feel in her fragile, broken body. Expand Keynote 5 and Keynote 6 into 1,500 characters. Don't add any headings, no edit tunnel endings. Just proper speech, exmated version. That make people feel cry about this story. 3 days later, Marcus stood before a sea of cameras and reporters. The weight of the entire world pressing down on his shoulders. He wore a simple black suit, but no clothing could mask the raw pain etched into his face. His hands, those hands that once built dollhouses for Nia and taught Jordan how to throw a football, now trembled slightly as he gripped the podium. The room was silent, except for the clicking of cameras, waiting for him to speak. When he did, his voice cracked on the first word, and a collective breath held across the room. He spoke of Nia, of her love for stargazing, her dreams of healing others as a doctor. He spoke of the terror that came crashing into their home, of the betrayal, of the heartbreak no parent should ever have to know. Tears streamed openly down Angela's face as she sat behind him, her hands clutched tightly together, praying for the strength to endure this unbearable moment. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't rage. His words were steady, slicing through the room like a scalpel, deliberate and devastating. "My daughter's blood cried out from our floor," he said, his voice breaking. "And it demands justice." Reporters wept. Officers in the back hung their heads. And somewhere across thousands of living rooms in America, hearts shattered with his. When the lawsuit was finally filed, it made headlines worldwide. $45 million. No amount of money could ever return Nia's laughter, her dreams, her future. But Marcus and Angela knew this fight wasn't just for their daughter anymore. It was for every family who feared the sound of sirens, for every child who slept with one eye open. The court battle was grueling, filled with attempts to shift blame and avoid responsibility. But Marcus, carrying the invisible scars of war and the unbearable wound of losing his daughter's innocence, never wavered. In the end, the jury's decision came down like a thunderclap, unanimous. The police department was found guilty of negligence, recklessness, and the systematic failures that led to the tragedy. As the judge read the final ruling, Marcus closed his eyes and let a single tear fall. It wasn't victory. It wasn't healing, but it was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of a reckoning for a broken system that had nearly destroyed them. Months later, standing on a stage in front of a crowd that had gathered not out of curiosity, but out of love and solidarity, Nia spoke for herself. The bullet that tore through her body had not stolen her spirit. Her voice was soft but unwavering, her eyes shining with both pain and incredible strength. There was a hush across the field as she clutched the microphone with trembling hands and began to speak. She didn't talk about hatred. She didn't speak of revenge. Instead, she spoke of forgiveness. "They took something from me that I can never get back," she said, her voice breaking. "But I choose to forgive because I refuse to let hate live in my heart." Tears streamed down the faces of strangers and loved ones alike. Angela clutched Marcus's hand so tightly it hurt, both of them unable to hold back their sobs. Their daughter, who had every right to be angry, every right to rage against the world, stood before them offering nothing but grace. The power of her words lifted something heavy off the hearts of those listening, and for a moment it felt like healing was possible, like hope could still find a way through even the darkest of nights. The Johnson family's pain sparked something bigger than themselves. Across the country, protests grew not out of anger alone, but out of a fierce, urgent demand for change. Laws began to shift. Departments reevaluated their protocols. Nia's name became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of resilience. Schools taught her story. Activists carried her photo at rallies. Parents held their children a little closer at night. A movement had been born, fueled by the bravery of a young girl who refused to be defined by her scars. Marcus and Angela, once just a quiet, loving family in a suburban neighborhood, were now voices for millions, pushing for a world where no other family would ever have to endure the nightmare they lived. They had lost so much, but in their suffering, they had sown seeds of hope, of change, and of a future that Nia had always dreamed of helping to heal. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-wrenching journey. Nia Johnson's story isn't just a story of a family torn apart by tragedy. It's a story of what happens when the worst of humanity meets the best. It's about a mother, a father, and a daughter who, despite the unimaginable, chose forgiveness, chose to stand up not just for themselves, but for every person who's ever been let down by the very systems they were told would protect them. It's about resilience, about a light shining through the darkest of times. But this story doesn't end here. Nia's name, her courage, her strength, they are forever etched in the hearts of those who heard her story. And it is up to all of us to ensure that her bravery leads to change. Her battle may have started in the most painful way imaginable, but it ignited something much bigger than one family's fight for justice. It sparked a movement, a demand for accountability, for a future where no child's life is ever torn apart by fear, by recklessness, by hate. So as you walk away from this story, remember this: change doesn't come from sitting in silence. It comes from the voices of those who refuse to let the world forget. Like Nia, like Marcus, like Angela, together we must raise our voices for those who can't. If you've been moved by this story, if it stirred something in you, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it, speak out, and let's ensure that the sacrifice, the courage, and the tears that went into this story never fade into the background. A1 Storyteller will always be here to bring you the real stories that matter, stories that inspire, that heal, and that demand a better tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and remember, every voice counts, every story matters. Never stop listening.